Hi, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. Thank you so much for joining us today. Okay, sorry, a little bit of systems confusion on our end, but we're so glad to have you here. I'm the Legal Defense Campaign Coordinator for No More Deaths.
I'm our Media and Communications Coordinator.
And the point of this webinar today is to give you an insight into the legal challenges we've been facing, unpack some of the court cases and the charges and the results of some of the cases as we head into our felony retrial next week in 2 days. Just some logistics. There's a bunch of people on this call. We're going to try to keep muting you, but if you could be vigilant and keep yourself muted, that would be awesome. If you have a question, please type it into the chat box. Please try to avoid drawing on the screen. We see some of you have done that already. And if you could refrain from doing that, it would be incredibly useful. Thank you so much. Okay. Oops.
All right, so we are going to kind of go over a bunch of the legal cases, but before we do that, we realized that we needed to kind of give people just a little bit of background about the work of No More Deaths. I'm guessing a lot of y'all are familiar with our work, but just kind of wanted to show where we work. This is a map of Southern Arizona, and we work mostly, we're a Tucson-based organization. And we have a couple different main regions that we work in. One of them is directly south of Tucson around the town of Arivaca, which this arrow is pointing to. And then the other area is around the town of Ajo, which that other arrow is pointing out. And the reason that our work has to exist is because of the way the border was militarized. It diverted migration away from cities into remote wilderness. And then you can see these red squares on the map. Those are all internal Border Patrol checkpoints. And so not only are folks directed away from urban centers, but they also have their journey time and distance extended by these internal checkpoints that are on every single paved road leaving the border zone. Many of those checkpoints are 20 to 30 miles from the border, and then there are also some that are up to 80 to 90 miles. And so those are roads that just push people into remote terrain and make the journey extremely long and dangerous. So this is a big timeline that we're going to go over in more detail, but we just wanted to kind of initially recognize that there's misdemeanor charges and felony charges that we're dealing with, and that's probably created a lot of confusion with our supporters, because there's cases that Scott's involved in, there's cases he's not involved in. He actually has two different types of charges. Some are that are actually all still pending, and so we want to kind of clear up some of that confusion and give context and background. So this is another map of Southern Arizona, and this one is of the known migrant deaths in Southern Arizona. And I say known migrant deaths because there are a lot of deaths that are unknown of migrants. A lot of people, when they die in the borderlands, their bodies are never found. So there's a lot of there's a big lack of clarity about what is actually the scale of this crisis and how many people have died. But we know since the mid-90s that at least 3,000 people's bodies have been found in Arizona alone. And so our group was founded in 2004 as a response to an increase in deaths that was a result of government policy. And we expanded our work from the main area that we were in Arivaca to the area around Ajo, which is where this circle is. And that area is known as the West Desert. And all of our pending legal cases and all of the legal cases from the past 2 years, they've all been centered around that area. So some of those charges are in the town of Ajo, and some of them are in the area west of Ajo called the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge. So we're going to kind of break down some of those differences and kind of explain the reason for those charges. Let's see. So when we started expanding in 2014 into the West Desert, we started to just find that there were a lot of people crossing through there, and we started to just learn more about that area. And so in 2016 in the winter, we decided to run a full month of programming and volunteer activity out there. And in the first week of that programming in 2016, we found 4 sets of human remains in only 5 days. And so I think what that taught us was that the areas on the map where there weren't any known deaths, it didn't mean that nobody was dying there. It just meant that they weren't being found. And so I think that was a big reality check on the whole organization of just seeing the scale of the crisis in the Ajo corridor in the West Desert, and also seeing that there weren't, the distances in that area were a lot different than they were in the Aravaca corridor. Out there it's up to 80 miles. It's hotter. It gets up to 120 degrees. It freezes overnight in the winter. There's also a big chunk of land where people are walking through an active bombing range. And so I think we were all just a little overwhelmed, and saw that we needed to really, as an organization, commit to intervening and focusing our work in that area. So after a lot of discussions, we decided to have more of a presence out there and really focus our work. And so in the summer of 2017, we expanded and worked a lot more on the Cabeza Prieta National Wildlife Refuge, and really just tried to intervene in what we saw was a really big crisis that we weren't fully aware of and didn't fully understand. And so once we started working out there, though, it became clear that the need was extensive. So as we started to work out there on Cabeza Prieta, we started to put out water and food and all of the resources that we had in the past in other areas to prevent people from dying. And we started dialogue with the wildlife refuge and other land managers. And then we just started to be out there on foot a lot more. And the response from the wildlife refuge, to go out there, you need to get a permit at their visitor center, and you kind of just sign off that you understand the rules and regulations of the area. And so we'd go and get those permits every time we went out. But in the summer of 2017, in direct response to our increased presence, they changed their permit language. So here is the clause that they added, and it essentially says, I agree that I will not abandon personal property, and then it lists water bottles, water containers, food items, food containers, blankets, clothing, footwear, and medical supplies. So essentially they changed their permit language to target no more deaths and make it really clear that they were against the work that we're doing, that they did not want us to be present there, and that they wanted us to stop. And so this is a map of the whole wildlife refuge, and just to kind of really illustrate why we started going into that area. Once they changed the permit and we started spending more time out there, it became really clear that they were watching us and keeping tabs on what we were doing. So every time that we went out to the refuge, we would be stopped by law enforcement. We would have our information written down, we'd have our IDs and our permits checked. And then often we would also, if we told them what we were doing, because we're a transparent organization, we don't hide, we're doing humanitarian aid, we would often get escorted out of the refuge, and just told that what we were doing we weren't allowed to do, and asked to leave, including at one point a case where we were actively looking for a person that had gone missing. But this map just really shows that the thing that we were seeing and the thing that we were trying to intervene on was this really clear pattern that we were seeing year after year of deaths in this area called the Growler Valley. So you can see a really clear line of known migrant deaths, and people were starting to refer to that as the trail of death, and that's exactly where we started going, and where we started often getting escorted out by law enforcement. But during that summer, nobody was ever told that they were being cited. Nobody was ever told that they were being charged with a crime. People were just had their information taken and were escorted out.
Okay, so that brings us back to our timeline. So thanks, Paige, for that background. With all of that, in December of 2017, basically volunteers who had been out on Cabeza and had gone home to places like Minneapolis and Seattle started receiving knocks on their doors from the Department of Fish and Wildlife and started receiving summons to appear in Tucson federal court on federal misdemeanor charges. As we were starting to talk about that and figure out what to do in response to it, in January, on January 17th of 2018, excuse me, we released a report detailing Border Patrol's interference with our humanitarian aid efforts. It was accompanied by a video that went viral and had many millions of viewers and was footage of that we'd collected over the past 7 years showing Border Patrol removing or dumping out the water we'd placed in the desert. We released that report in the morning of the 17th, and several hours later, Border Patrol raided our aid station in Ajo and arrested Dr. Scott Warren, who also at that point had been served a summons to appear on misdemeanor charges. So then for all of 2018, we fought all of these charges as much as we could. Our lawyers filed motions in court. We had many hearings. We had petitions and sign-ons, which I know all of you signed onto and boosted. Thank you so much. We had more motions. We had more hearings. There's a lot of legal grounds to dismiss these charges, including the selective enforcement that Border Patrol was engaged in when they targeted Scott, including upholding international law, including violating, Scott and No More Death's right to free speech. So we argued very hard, but ultimately none of those motions got any of the charges dismissed. So in January of 2019, we faced our first trial. It was the first group of 4. And they were misdemeanor charges. And that group was found, more technical difficulties. They were found guilty on all charges. This is not new in No More Deaths history. People have been convicted at the local level of what equates to littering before, and we've always appealed it up and won on appeal. So that case is being appealed up to the Ninth Circuit at the moment. The next thing that happened was a month later in February, the government basically dropped the charges against a second group of 4 Cabeza defendants in exchange for them paying a fine. And we took this as a victory, boosting our claim that humanitarian aid is never a crime. Then, in May of 2019, we had the final misdemeanor trial, and that was for Scott's Cabeza charges. It was basically the exact same trial as the first trial, as the one that happened in January. And the judge in that misdemeanor case is the same judge as in Scott's felony case. And so that judge has decided that he is going to withhold a verdict on that case until Scott's felony case is resolved. So at this point, it's November, and we still don't have a verdict for that trial that happened in May. And then 3 weeks after that misdemeanor trial, we started a 2-week felony trial on Scott's felony charges, which are 2 counts of felony harboring, 1 count of felony conspiracy. That trial was 2 weeks long, the first 2 weeks of June. And after 3 days, whoever's drawing on the screen, if you could not do that, that'd be awesome. Thank you. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury came back. They said they could not make a decision, and they split 8 for acquittal and 4 for conviction. So then we were in limbo and we waited. And a month later, the government came back and said they were going to retry Scott. They were dropping the conspiracy charges. They were doing they were retrying him on the 2 harboring charges. So then that leads us to this moment where we are about to have a second felony trial starting on Tuesday, the 12th, and it will be a retrial of Dr. Warren on the federal harboring charges. So we're going to dive into the felony charges right now, because I know, all the charges are confusing. These are confusing. The first thing to note, as I said before, was we released this report detailing Border Patrol's interference with our aid efforts, and a few hours later, they arrested Scott Warren. What comes next, we want to be really clear that we are not lawyers, and that everything we're about to say, we have only learned because of these charges and working on this case and working to defend our friend. So if you have legal questions about the content we're about to review, we really encourage you to ask a lawyer and not ask us. We're happy to clarify anything about Scott's case at the end. So Scott is charged under 8 U.S. Code 1324, which is housed in sort of like the larger section of the U.S. Code that is about immigration. USC 1325 and 1326 are the set of laws that make it a crime to enter this country without papers, and a felony crime to do so for a second time. So Scott is charged under 1324. He was charged with 2 counts of felony harboring, one for each man that he was arrested with. He was arrested with 2 men from Central America named Jose and Christian. And in the first trial, he was also charged with 1 count of felony conspiracy. So each harboring charge carries a maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. So 2 of them was a maximum sentence of 10. And the conspiracy charge carried a maximum sentence of 10. So in the first trial, he was looking at a total maximum sentence of 20 years in prison. For this trial, they have dropped the conspiracy charge, and he is now facing a maximum of 10 years in prison, 5 each for each count of felony harboring. So to dive into harboring, this is the language of the law. I'm not going to read it at you. You can Google 8 U.S.C. 1324 and read the entire law yourself. But there's 3 or 4 elements that the government needs to prove to have someone be convicted of felony harboring. So the first one is that the persons who the accused were helping were in the country undocumented, that they entered not through an authorized port of entry. The second one is that the people who are being accused, the defendant or defendants, knew or should have known that the people they were helping were undocumented. The third is that the accused, the defendants, offered those people assistance in the form of like a place to stay or a ride or somewhere to be, in a way that shielded them from detection from immigration enforcement. So this third part is very contested in different courts and under different cases. Some previous cases have ruled that all you have to have done is given someone a place to stay. And some cases have ruled that you have to have done that with the intent of shielding them from detection from law enforcement. So this is a case where wherever you are, we really encourage you to try to research the precedent set in your circuit court, because the rulings are really different. And if you're wanting to do that, we really encourage, just briefly, this resource. This is a legal memorandum. It was written by the National Immigration Project of the National Lawyers Guild, and it's where we got the majority of information about Scott's charges, and is really a deep dive into this one section of US Code. And we just put the link in the comments if you want to click on that to read it yourself. But so to go back to Scott's case specifically, there is precedent-setting rulings in the Ninth Circuit in which we're in, saying that the government has to prove that whatever the defendant did, they did with the intent to shield the undocumented people or the non-citizens from immigration enforcement. So in Scott's case, number 1, 2, and 3 here, right, are not in question, right? Like, Jose and Christian were undocumented. Scott definitely knew. They told him about parts of their journey from Central America. Scott definitely gave them food, bed, water, and clothing, right? And the question at hand and what the government has to prove is that Scott's intent was to do that in order to, like, quote unquote, help them evade Border Patrol. And we know, and all of you know, that Scott's intent, as well as the rest of our intent here at No More Deaths, is to end death and suffering, right? So we are living and operating in a context in which there's like a massive crisis of death and disappearance unfolding in our backyards. Scott lives in Ajo, a few miles away from that trail of death that Paige was talking about. Scott himself personally has been part of recovering 18 different sets of human remains. He's written articles about the spiritual power of like objects he finds left in the desert. He's a geographer, he makes maps, right? He just like drives around out there, knows the history of the land, like finds the bodies of people who has passed, and has like a really, really deep calling to offer care to folks who are facing potential death in their journey across the desert. So this is the broader context that was going on when Jose and Christian showed up at the barn and asked Scott for food and water. And basically what the government is trying to do through this case is they're trying to strip all the context away. They're trying to frame it like the only reason that Scott would allow Jose and Christian to stay at the barn was as to evade detection by Border Patrol, that there's no other reason, that the men were not in medical distress, that if they were in medical distress, the only legitimate actor and responder would have been Border Patrol. And so when we say that they were in medical distress, we are lying. And they're just trying to basically make it look like the offering of humanitarian aid is a smokescreen for a massive underground smuggling operation. This is a quote from the one of the federal attorneys who's prosecuting the case, who at the end of our closing argument in the last case said, context was nothing but another fancy word for confusion. So I think one thing that makes it really clear, right, that they recently filed a motion basically trying to make it so that the defense could not talk about Trump or Trump's policies. That motion hasn't been ruled on yet to our knowledge, but they're trying to basically sort of strip away the political context and strip away, you know, the real context of death and disappearance, and only focus on the fact that Scott did not call Border Patrol. I want to just take this moment, if there's a question in anyone's mind. The way the government is approaching this case is they're try to make it seem weird that Scott and the other No More Deaths volunteers didn't call Border Patrol, but there is no affirmative law in this country that says that you have to alert immigration enforcement when you encounter someone who you believe to be undocumented. That would be a terrifying law. It doesn't exist. Scott himself went to a Border Patrol Citizens Academy years ago, in which Border Patrol to his face told him that he did not need to alert them when he encounters undocumented people. So there's this weird like normalization thing that the government is trying to do by like being like, oh, if you encounter someone who is undocumented, the normal thing is to alert immigration enforcement, but that's not normal, and it's not required by law. So Scott's case is one of the growing number of cases being prosecuted under this statute. When he was still Attorney General in April of 2017, Jeffrey Sessions put out a memo to all federal prosecutors instructing them to focus on the harboring statute as a clear part of an overall immigration enforcement strategy for the country. As you can see from this graph, the number of prosecutions under 8 U.S.C. 1324 has been growing over the past 3 years. And so, yeah, we want to talk a little bit just about part of the reason we're having this webinar is because what the government is trying to do in Scott's case is set some really dangerous precedent that has the potential to shift what is criminally prosecutable in this country, right? And so in this country right now, we have hundreds of thousands of people involved in giving aid, giving sanctuary, giving care to their loved ones, their community members, their family members, some of whom are undocumented, right? And so a guilty verdict in Scott's case, you know, could set very dangerous precedent for mixed status families. It could set very dangerous precedent for people who are doing sanctuary work, for people who are doing deportation resistance. It could set dangerous precedent for doctors who treat undocumented people in their clinics, right? So there's a lot of people who right now, every day, are offering care and offering sanctuary, and who could be under potential greater threat if it becomes a crime to share food, water, bed, and clothing with undocumented people in this country. The other thing to note is just that this is an international phenomenon, right? So there's like lots of humanitarian aid workers in Europe who are also being criminally prosecuted. This is a graph of prosecution. They're being prosecuted under the same sort of like, not the exact same law, but the same sort of like framework of law, which is that humanitarian aid is equal to harboring, it's equal to transporting, it's equal to smuggling. So people are being prosecuted under these European Union laws, and the number of prosecutions against humanitarian workers in the EU has basically tripled from 8 to 24 in the past 3 years alone. So we want to sort of just really hone in on the fact that, you know, this prosecution of aid workers, both here and abroad, is really an extension of a sort of political framework around immigration that has been unfolding in this country for decades at this point. There were policies being put into place in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, where you know, that really criminalized migrant bodies, that really turned immigration from, you know, an immigration infracture, excuse me, from a civil penalty to a criminal penalty, that have increased the penalties against people for migrating. And I think we just see that it's on hyperdrive under the Trump administration with some of the policies that have come to being in like only the past 2 years. And we want to point this out because Scott is a very sympathetic character, and I think the work that No More Deaths does touches a core human value in many, many, many people. And the question we've been asking ourselves is just like, how do we use this moment and this focus that we're getting to put the border itself on trial, right? And to turn it around and be like, it's not only that humanitarian aid isn't a crime, right? Like, how do we use this moment and this attention to investigate and put into question all of the policies that are criminalizing migration in this country? So here's an interesting statistic that someone gave us recently. They emailed us like last week. They did a study where they asked a sampling of people if they thought that humanitarian aid given to migrants crossing the desert should be criminalized, if that activity should be criminalized. And it came back that 86.8% of people believe that it shouldn't be. And that included 70% of Republicans, right? And so when they wrote us, they were like, this is pretty uncommon. It's really standard on issues of immigration for things to split pretty evenly across party lines, but this one issue seems to be something where most people believe that at the point of death, someone should be able to be given water and food, and like the people giving them shouldn't be criminalized or penalized for doing it, right? So it does seem that the majority of this country, at least at this moment, believes that humanitarian aid shouldn't be criminalized. And we're interested in exploring, like, how do you get from that to the idea that migration itself shouldn't be criminalized, right? And like humanitarian aid only exists because of the response to the criminalization of migration in the first place.
All right, so we've got our felony retrial starts on Tuesday. And I know a lot of people are going to be paying attention and watching, but we're also kind of going into the holiday season. So we wanted to just give people some kind of concepts to talk about when they're talking about the case and talking about immigration issues and border issues. So one of the kind of main concepts that I think has really come up in this trial is that basic acts of kindness are being criminalized. So what Scott did, according to the charging documents, are share food, water, clothing, and beds to people who asked him for it. So these are kind of values, and sharing is something that kids are taught in Sunday school. It's behavior that we encourage of all people. And so the fact that when somebody is undocumented, that similar kind of idea of kindness and compassion is not only seen as wrong, but also people are threatened with prison time. I think that's a helpful way to frame it, about the idea of compassion being under attack. I also want to kind of expand and say that, as No More Deaths, we started in 2004, but we by no means started humanitarian aid in the borderlands. A lot of people who have lived along the border have always given food and water to people crossing through their backyards. And so it's a very deep value that a lot of these border communities that we work in have, of like, if somebody is in need, you provide for them and people take care of each other. Migration should not be a death sentence. So there's kind of, at certain points, the government has kind of thrown around the idea that if you give somebody food and water, you're helping them commit a crime, because if they cross the border, quote, illegally, and you help them continue that, then you're complicit in that crime. But I think what we kind of want to push back on is nobody is saying that the punishment for migrating should be a death sentence. And that's what the government has done through all of their policies, is they've actively and intentionally funneled people into deadly corridors. And so when people do commit a crime, they go through due process. And so even if you don't support people crossing the border, I think everybody can agree that it should not be a death sentence. The other kind of main point is that these arrests, we believe, were retaliatory. So they infringe upon Scott and No More Death's constitutionally protected right to criticize our government. The day that Scott was arrested, we had released a video and a report detailing Border Patrol interference with humanitarian aid, including them destroying food and water. That was a significant thing that happened that day. The type of work that Scott was doing, providing care to people, is something that No More Deaths has done since 2004. And it's something we've continued to do since then. We're continuing to respond to the crisis of death and disappearance because the crisis is ongoing. And so the only thing that, to us, and we've also been in dialogue with Border Patrol, but we've always just done the same things to intervene in this crisis by providing humanitarian aid. So the thing that was significant about that day is that we had released this report. And so in many ways, that type of targeting is retaliatory, and it dissuades people from speaking out against injustices by the government. And we also see this in the context of a wider national targeting of people that are working to expose governmental violations of human rights, as well as just kind of the deportation machine and detention machine that's been built. A lot of people across the country that have been organizing against it have also been targeted. So whether that's Ravi Ragbir with the New Sanctuary Coalition, or Maru Mora up in Seattle, or Jose Montelongo in Flagstaff, we've seen a pretty consistent pattern of retaliation and targeting of migrant justice advocates nationwide. And the final concept is just about international law. So humanitarian assistance is protected under numerous international laws and standards. And a lot of No More Deaths protocol was written to mirror the parts of the Red Cross Code of Conduct. And I think what kind of is helpful for framing is that I think No More Deaths sees it as our duty to respond to the crisis, and seeing the U.S. government is actually in violation of international laws and standards in regards to the way that they're processing asylum seekers, and then actively forcing people to cross through really dangerous terrain. as well as just the numerous violations and abuses that we've seen in Border Patrol custody, as well as immigration detention. So I think we see our work as kind of protected under international law and also responding to the US's violations of that law.
Cool. So we just wanted to move on, and hopefully those are some points you can use to talk about this case to other people. And we wanted to wrap up just by talking about some of the things that y'all can do to support us in this work. The first and the most important thing is like, don't let care be criminalized, right? And like resist the government's moves to shift what is normal in this country. I know we've got people here from across the country, and there's so much work going on in so many places. So we just really want to encourage you to get involved in the work wherever you are, and support it there, whether it's like helping out with local sanctuary work, or whether it's joining a rapid response team to resist deportations, or whether it's mounting resistance against a proposed or existing detention facility. Like, I promise you, there are groups doing work in your area. And if there aren't groups doing work in your area, maybe find some friends and start a group. But what's so important is that we don't let it become the new normal, that people are afraid to offer care and compassion to undocumented people in this country.
And I'm just gonna kind of hop in. I feel like a lot of people want to come down and support the work of No More Deaths and put water out on the border, and we encourage people to do so if they're able to. But we also recognize that the border is everywhere, and that it affects people in the interior, and that we should approach the work to prevent deportations and keep people in their communities with the same urgency that we approach work on the border. So while the border is everywhere, I think resistance is also everywhere, and there's ways to plug in and intervene in this and help out your neighbor.
The next thing you can do is talk about this case with people. I think, as I said earlier, there's a lot of sympathy for the moment of intervention that No More Deaths is doing. And we believe that we can expand on that moments of sympathy and pivot from deaths in the desert to abuses in detention, to the horrors of the Remain in Mexico policy, to family separation, right? And like, use these prosecutions against aid workers to sort of like carve out space in the sort of overall dialogue around immigration enforcement in this country. Another one is, so next Wednesday, the day after trial begins, a group called the Detention Watch Network is holding a national call-in day for their Defund Hate campaign. Detention Watch has been really focused on the way that ICE and CBP have been continuously expanding their funding every year, congressional funding, and there are abuses of that practice, and they're really trying to encourage Congress to stop increasing funding for detention and deportation. And if you're moved by Scott's case, you know, it's the same funds that are going to, you know, fund Border Patrol pouring out water gallons that it is to fund ICE detaining people in their communities. So if you want to join the call-in day, we'll have more info on that coming up. Another thing you can do is to write an op-ed or letter to the editor in your local paper, or you could try for a national paper as well. We've got a guide to how to write one up on our website, www.nomoredeaths.org. And if you do get one published, please send it our way, because we'd love to feature it. And then you can also donate. We've had a lot of attention because of these federal charges. And fingers crossed, this is our final trial. Fingers crossed, Scott is acquitted and found not guilty. And after that, we will still be out in the desert every day, searching for missing people and putting out water and running a desert aid clinic and responding to this crisis. So if you wanted to take this moment to commit to becoming a monthly donor, it would really, really help us in the weeks and years to come. And then finally, we just wanted to say that we'll be live tweeting from the courthouse as much as possible. And we'd love for you to follow us and comment and share and boost our asks. So you can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at No More Deaths. And we'll take this moment to read through some of your questions. If you've got questions, please feel to type them into the chat box and we'll see what we can answer.
So I saw it wasn't a question per se, but a comment from earlier saying that these are the same arguments used against people doing in the sanctuary movement in the 80s. And that's exactly right. And actually a lot of our founding members are people that were in the sanctuary movement, such as John Fife and Margot Cowan. They were all charged with felonies, and they were part of that movement as well. And then once there was an increase in deaths in the desert, they were some of the founders of the Samaritans and No More Deaths. So we're definitely very connected to that work and that movement. There was another question about what is the motive? What motive is there to smuggle someone if you're not being paid? I think that's some of the absurdity of this trial. The arguments that came up in court, they were pulling things that No More Deaths had tweeted months and years ago and trying to politicize the trial and talk about how No More Deaths was this political organization that didn't have humanitarian efforts, and that because we had called for the abolition of Border Patrol at the end of some of our reports about their abuses, that Scott's motivation was aligned with No More Deaths to basically thwart Border Patrol at every turn, and therefore his intentions were criminal. So while he wasn't getting money because he was part of this organization, he had ulterior motives. There's a question about sending this presentation out. Yeah, we're happy to do that, to send the PowerPoint, and then also this video is being recorded, and so there will be a version of it that you can download and watch and share. And anybody who didn't call in will be able to watch this recording as well.
Are there any other questions about the charges or the arguments or some of the concepts we're hoping everyone to leave this with? So there was a question about whether Scott was at the barn to meet volunteers. That's true, he was. We have text messages showing that he was on his way to the barn to cook dinner for the volunteers who were coming that day. And when he got to the barn, Jose and Christian were there. So that's definitely being brought up in his defense. We will totally keep y'all posted about the trial. Twitter is really the best way. We try to send out tweets every time there's a break in court. We have two very amazing lawyers who have volunteered both for Scott's misdemeanor trial, his first felony trial, and now his retrial. So they're really committed, and we're really honored that they're working with us. On Tuesday, we're having a press conference at 8 in the morning. I believe that jury selection will begin at 9 or 9:30, but we will actually not be allowed in the courtroom for jury selection. There won't be enough room. Hardly any media will get in. So we'll be going into the courtroom around 1 or 1:30. If you're not on social media, a good way to follow the trial is we do a daily rundown on our website every day. So you can go and you can read. We post it usually around 8 or 9 at night because we're busy till then. But you can go and read the rundown and learn everything that happened. And yes, someone just asked me, do they have to prove all 3 elements to get a guilty plea? They do. They have to prove, in this case, 4 elements. Although in this case, we're not contesting 3 of the elements. We're not contesting that Jose and Christian were undocumented. We're not contesting that Scott knew, and we're not contesting that Scott gave them aid. We're only contesting that Scott's intent was to break the law. yes, we would love people to make signs and posters for Tuesday. We'll have a bunch of banners, so if you don't spend like 12 hours making a sign, because there might not be room for it, but please come, help us hold banners. And yes, you can, it's encouraged if you're going to be inside the courtroom to have no political messaging on you whatsoever. There is, the transcript from the first trial is available online, and if you write me at this email address, I can send it to you. We had to download it from a public records document that costs a lot of money. So if you, if you write to me at that email address, I will send you the transcripts. And again, the question of how you follow the trial is, if you're not on social media, I would check our website every day.
I'm going to go back and pick up a question that there are two questions that came earlier. One was somebody asking about like mental health resources for people working in the borderlands. We actually have an active call out right now that you can find on our website for different healers, whether that be people who provide therapy or just different types of healing. We're trying to find people that can support our volunteer base so that we can do this trauma work effectively and for a long period of time. There was also a question about if it came up in court that part of this issue is also forcing migrants to cross through indigenous lands and kind of like putting that trauma and that violence onto indigenous lands. And I would say that it hasn't really come up in court, and I think that's part of the active erasure that the government is doing of this issue. If we went back to the map, there's a really big chunk of the borderlands that is the Tohono O'odham Nation, pardon me. And in that area, we don't put out food and water. A lot of community members do provide care to folks informally. And we go out there just when we have permission for search and rescue and search and recovery. But I can't speak much more to it. There's a lot of complicated dynamics there at play, as with any land jurisdiction. But I think that is a big piece of this, and just the fact that the border really, it cuts through the lands of 16 different peoples border wide. And so I think, it absolutely is forcing a lot of indigenous people from south of the border to cross through the nation and all these other places. So it hasn't been talked about actively in court as much, but I think that's part of the active denial of what's happening here. The judge from the retrial is the same as the first trial, and it's Judge Rainier Collins, and he also oversaw Scott's misdemeanor case, and so that's why that one is also still hanging. It wasn't a jury trial, it was a bench trial, so he'll make the ruling on that.
I would say I think Scott and all of us here at No More Deaths, I would say we're doing okay. I would say we have an awesome team of people working very, very hard around the clock. And I would also say that we would rather be out in the fields doing that work than fighting these charges in federal court. These charges are bogus and designed to distract us from our work. And I think we have kept up a field presence throughout 2 years of criminal prosecution, and that's really amazing. And we all just want to get back to addressing the actual crisis. I don't know if there's an age minimum for who can sit in the courtroom. I don't believe so, because we've had high school students in there before. But if you are going to come to the court, you should bring an ID, because you do need to show ID in order to get in the building. So I don't know how people under 18 would deal with that, or if there's an ID that you have, but you might want to call the court, which is the DeConcini Federal Courthouse. Paige will type up the name. And if you call them, they might be able to tell you how you get in. Any final questions? Yeah, that's a good question.
I can read the questions.
Okay. I don't know if everyone can read these questions. They're in the chat box. Someone just asked, is there's anything specific that'll try to be emphasized in this retrial that was effective on the jury in the first trial? I think a lot of that stuff, number one, we are not lawyers, and we don't have a say on Scott's legal team. But I think a lot of that is going to be figured out sort of in the moment, and based on the questions that the jurors are feeding back after every witness, right? So witnesses are examined, cross-examined, redirected, and then jurors get to ask questions. And based on those questions, I think the lawyers will be try to tailor their legal strategy. Oh, and just a new thing in the defense is last time we weren't, and I'm personally hoping this makes the difference. Last time we weren't even allowed to mention the report at all. This time we do get to ask the government agents about the text messages they sent the day Scott was arrested and about if they knew about the report. We don't get to admit the contents of the report as evidence, so we don't get to show the video or give people a copy of the report, but we do get, it does get to be known that a report was released that morning that was indicting of Border Patrol's activities. The jury is made up of 5 counties in southern Arizona: Pima, Cochise, Graham, Santa Cruz, and Greenlee. They'll probably mostly come from Pima County because that's the largest and most populated. Someone asked if the jury was made up only of Arizona residents.
Let's give this plug and more questions will come in.
Okay.
Feel free to continue asking questions, but just while we have a little moment, I also want to plug that November 12th is the start of Scott's trial, but it also is the same date as 2 pretty significant Supreme Court case hearings in Washington, D.C. So one of those is a case about DACA in 2017, which is a deferred action for childhood arrivals. It's a kind of temporary protection against deportation that Obama implemented through an executive order that in 2017 Donald Trump tried to cancel, and that cancellation was blocked by a couple different courts, and the blocking of that case or of the cancellation is getting appealed and is now going to be heard by the Supreme Court on November 12th as well. So it's a pretty significant date for all the folks that are fighting that as well. And the second case that's going to be heard that day is Hernandez v. Mesa, which is a case about cross-border shootings. And it's about a case in Texas where a Border Patrol agent shot a 15-year-old named Sergio Hernandez across the border. So he was standing in the U.S., shot into Mexico, and killed this 15-year-old boy. And no criminal charges were filed, but the family of Sergio filed a civil claim to try to sue the government. And so that case has also gone through various appeals and is going to be heard by the Supreme Court. And that one's going to set precedent for a case that I think a lot of people in Arizona are familiar with, which is that of Jose Antonio Elena Rodriguez, who was a 16-year-old shot and killed by a Border Patrol agent named Lonnie Schwartz. And he actually did have criminal charges filed, and they happened in the same courthouse as Scott's case and were heard by the same judge, and also ended in a hung jury with a mistrial twice. So Jose Antonio's family is going to be attending along with the Hernandez family to see if they have the right to sue the government for murdering their kids.
Will you copy and paste the donation info from the website? I just want to reply to that. Someone made a comment that this seems like a religious freedoms issue, and we agree, and a religious freedoms defense is a defense we've used in some of the cases. I think they're not using it this time around because religious freedoms law is actually pretty complicated and pretty difficult for a jury to understand. We use religious freedoms defenses in the Cabeza cases, and I don't think the law was very well understood or applied in those cases. So I don't want to say it's not a religious freedoms issue. I just think that that's not what we're emphasizing this time around. Paige also just put the information on how to donate in the chat box. But again, if anyone can't see the chat, the website is www.nomoredeaths, and if you go there, there's instructions for how to make an online donation or to write a check and where to send it.
So the question is about if No More Deaths has relationships with faith communities in Tucson who will be showing up on Tuesday. Yeah, we absolutely do. We're actually a ministry of the Unitarian Universalist Church of Tucson, and a lot of our founding members are pastors and ministers and people of faith. And so we, on Tuesday, we definitely will have folks showing up. And then the following Wednesday, we're going to have kind of like a Faith Floods the Courtroom event, similar to the one that we did during last trial, and bring really an interfaith movement or interfaith group of people to kind of stand in solidarity with Scott coming from all over the country. So we definitely have a lot of connections with the faith community in Tucson and in a lot of the communities that we work in and everywhere. But yeah, if people of faith want to write op-eds and post on their social media and talk to their congregations, that is amazing, and just kind of promoting the values that we've talked about compassion and helping people out.
I think there's a question about the call-in day on Wednesday. We haven't posted it yet, but we will soon, maybe tomorrow, or maybe later today if we get to it.
So there's a question. Do you know what the prosecution is saying about the fact that Border Patrol did not have a warrant or consent from Scott as to how they were justified in entering the barn? Reasonable suspicion? This is actually an interesting one. During all of the motions, our defense team filed that it was an illegal search, and therefore all of the evidence collected should be thrown out. And the government came back and argued that Scott did not have legal standing at the barn. So he wasn't a caretaker. He didn't have legal standing to control who was and wasn't able to search the barn. And so Border Patrol said that they performed what's called a knock and talk, and that then they did a safety sweep to make sure to kind of protect against officer safety. So they kind of like ran around, ignored when Scott tried to exercise his rights to refuse the warrantless search, and they went into the space and searched it without a warrant. And then, so the argument was that he did not have legal standing. But then later, the government has now been basing their entire argument off of the idea that Scott was in charge of the barn. He had all of the power. He was coordinating that space, and basically was totally in charge, and therefore could be charged with this crime. So the legal team also decided to intervene in that and was unsuccessful. So there's this really clear theme of kind of doublespeak where they're saying, oh, he doesn't have standing, he's kind of a nobody at the barn, and then now they're saying, oh, he was like the guy in control. And who does have legal standing? So they would argue that the owner of the property, who is a retired doctor in Ajo, I think they would say would be the only person, although she had given Scott keys to the barn, and was allowing not just No More Deaths, but many other humanitarian aid organizations to base their work out of that space. It was never just No More Deaths that was using that space. It was also other groups that were working to intervene in the crisis. So the question is, don't they need to get consent from that doctor then? Well, what they argue is that they were just doing a knock and talk. So they set up surveillance. They saw people that they said, quote, appeared to be undocumented, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that they racially profiled them. And then they went and demanded that the door be open. And then once they were able to get inside the space, they were able to search it for what they call officer safety. So they did not get consent from the doctor who owned the barn. They did not get consent from Scott. They did not have a warrant. I think also kind of along the lines of the fact that they just kind of said that these people looked undocumented and didn't really have much more description other than that they were brown. One of the agents that was part of that surveillance was transferred to New Hampshire, and we recently got sent an article where that agent was involved in arresting a few undocumented men at a thrift store in New Hampshire, and is now they're being sued by the ACLU. So I think when we say the border is everywhere, that's a pretty clear connection where the Border Patrol agent that arrested Scott is now in New Hampshire arresting undocumented people that he's profiling at a thrift store. So I think, yeah, they did not have consent, and they did not they did not have a warrant.
Yeah, I also think that, I mean, there's so much information about these cases. Like, a thing to know is that the agents who arrested Scott had been surveilling him for months. They had his license plate number, they knew his home address. The people from Fish and Wildlife, when they needed to serve Scott a summons for the misdemeanor charges, like, it was Border Patrol who gave them Scott's address um, to serve the summons. So there's like a lot of unofficial cross-agency collaboration, a lot of surveillance and spying that's also not warranted and doesn't come with a warrant. And so I'm not surprised that Border Patrol didn't wait that day to get a warrant to enter the property. They just barged right in and arrested 3 people. Sorry, we're just taking a second to read the questions.
There's a question about Scott and if he's a PhD or an MD. He is a PhD in geography, and he wrote his dissertation about the history of Ajo and the land around it. So he's a doctor of geography, but is a wilderness first responder, so he does have some medical training.
There's a question about Border Patrol. Sorry, it's a question about like the search of the barn. There's the search of the barn is shady. Border Patrol surveilling Scott is shady. These are all the pretrial motions that we filed to get all these charges or get the evidence thrown out. Personally, every time I read a pretrial motion from the defense, I was like, that's it, it's over, we won, they got nothing in the face of this. And then the judge would rule, right? And he doesn't always, I haven't experienced him ruling. He doesn't always rule in our favor, and he doesn't always rule in their favor. So yes, there's shady stuff about the way that Scott's arrest went down, and it was clearly retaliatory, and that hasn't been enough to date to get the evidence thrown out or the charges dropped. Paige is also typing. There's a lot of really in-depth articles about Scott's trial on The Intercept, written by a reporter, Ryan Devereaux. And we tried to like keep this presentation out of the weeds because there's so many weeds. But if you want to get in the weeds, read all of Ryan's article. You can host a reading party at your house and read them all back to back. Yes, we are doing things to prevent online surveillance of our communications, but we're not going to tell you what they are.
Yeah, I think this is also a really tricky thing because we, as a humanitarian aid organization, we shouldn't have to hide what we're doing.
Yeah.
Our mission is to end death and suffering. So I think, we've always been a transparent organization. We meet with Border Patrol. We talk to the people that are our opponents to try to find a way to work with them. Because at the end of the day, yes, our goal is to expose Border Patrol and kind of show what they're doing, but our end goal is to end death and suffering. And so we don't want to fight a fight just to fight it. We want to make sure that we're always thinking about the bigger picture and how we can intervene in a more effective way. But we're not trying to be like an underground secret society. We want to be open and accessible, and we want to encourage other people to take similar action to what we're doing and to help people and to do what they can to prevent death in their backyard. There's a question, what happened to Jose and Cristian after they were arrested? Did they make statements that were used in the trial? So they became material witnesses for the part of the government. So they were detained for a few months, and then they were questioned and then deported. And so their video of their depositions were shown in court last time and will be shown again. That their depositions are also available online again through all the court transcripts. But we haven't been in touch with them just because the lawyers kind of urged us and said that anything that we did to try to reach out and support them or follow up could be viewed as witnessing with as tampering with witnesses. And so it's been kind of an unfortunate block where we haven't the story that we've been able to tell and really focus on and the support that we've been able to give has kind of mostly gone to Scott. And Jose and Cristian's stories haven't really been featured as much because we just haven't been able to be in communication with them.
Any final questions? I think the rest of the question is coming.
Okay. I'll also plug, Scott's arrest came on the tail of part 2 of our disappeared report. Those are all available online. There's part 1 and 2 right now, and we're also going to come out with part 3 in a few months. It's going to detail emergency non-response in the borderlands and just looking at the way that there's a discriminatory 911 response to people that go missing.
Is it the disappeared report or disappeared report?
And I'm gonna grab that for you.
We're gonna get the link to that report. So there's a question: how aggressively have Border Patrol agents been going after Nowhere Deaths volunteers lately? Yeah, that's how aggressively. None of our volunteers have been arrested since, and also we have interactions all the time, and Border Patrol, we run a desert aid station outside Arivaca. Border Patrol continues to surveil it, sometimes surrounds it. They haven't gotten a warrant to enter it since 2 summers ago. So it seems, our impression is so far like both sides have been waiting out this case and seeing how it plays out. And we're concerned that if Scott is found guilty, they'll pursue us more aggressively, and we're concerned if Scott is found not guilty, they'll retaliate again in a different way.
I think it's also it's worth noting that Scott was arrested, he spent the night in detention, but then he was released on his own recognizance, and he's been dealing with these charges hanging, which has definitely been a really big burden and a difficult thing. But I think we as volunteers, what we face in retaliation and government targeting is really, I think in many ways pales in comparison to what undocumented folks deal with when they cross the border. You look at violence in the field at the hands of Border Patrol, and there's zero accountability. You look at violence and abuse in short-term Border Patrol custody, and there's also zero accountability and consistent violations, and just a real culture of cruelty, which we've been documenting since 2008. So I think they're coming after us, but it is always going to be an expansion of what they've been doing for decades against undocumented people and devaluing their lives, and just perpetuating really, really intense levels of violence consistently.
There's a question about how we share the webinar. We're gonna try to figure it out and email it out to everyone who registered, and maybe post it on our social media and website.
Yeah, it should be probably by tomorrow. There'll be a link available, and it'll just be a video.
How many more people have showed interest in volunteering since Scott was arrested? We've had a steady stream of volunteers. I think that these prosecutions have really raised the profile of the organization, and so yeah, we have a lot of people wanting to come out with us every month, and we wish we could accept more folks. We're just limited by our own capacity and how complex it is, and how much information we have to share with people in order for them to be responsibly onboarded. But yeah, I remember one month, like a few months ago, we had 50 people, I think, apply for our month-long Desert Aid program in 1 month, which, was a lot of work on our end to read and sort through all those applications. And applications are open on our website now if you want to come out. We really seek people with medical experience and people who have conversational or better Spanish. But if you want to come out, even if you don't speak Spanish and don't have medical skills, still apply.
The question is about other volunteers other than Scott been followed in their daily life by government agents. It's hard to say because I think often the surveillance is covert, so we don't know. But I guess for a personal example, Ryan Devereaux, who works with The Intercept, he was doing a lot of coverage of the Cabeza trials and doing freedom of information requests and public records requests. And he emailed me one day and was like, "Hey, I saw your name in this document." And I'd been with people who were out in that summer putting out water on Cabeza. I'd interacted with law enforcement, but I never had any charges filed against me. But Ryan uncovered this draft letter from the wildlife refuge that was written on letterhead, and it basically said, "Dear Paige," and it had like a bunch of question marks for the date, and it said draft as a watermark, and it said, "This letter is to inform you that on question mark, question mark, question mark, you are being charged with question mark, question mark, question mark." So they had basically written a letter to me, but not actually filled it out. It was just like a template that they were like expecting that I was going to commit a crime, and so they just had it on deck ready to go. But I think as far as volunteers getting followed, I think we assume that it's probably happened, but we don't know to what extent, and there's not really a way to find out. But it was a pretty chilling moment when I get this letter from the refuge manager written to me that was never sent, accusing me of something I never did.
I'd also say we've got Freedom of Information Act requests into CBP that we've had in for several months, asking them about surveillance of our Desert Aid Station and our volunteers, and predictably they keep stalling. So I think at this point we have a journalist who is suing them to try to get that information. So maybe check back in a month and we'll be able to show you the documents with all of our names on them.